So I've been doing some thinking about the problems of evidence-based policymaking and which policies set out. So the timing, is it the type of evidence, is it that we need to try and maximise the use of evidence, and what we can learn from evidence-based medicine when we're thinking about how to solve some of these problems. So I'm sure lots of you know this story already, but the history of evidence-based medicine is all down to this guy, who's about as expert as they can. He's got the glasses, he's got the white hair, he's got a lot of letters after his name. So this is Archie Cochrane, and he noticed that lots of his colleagues were, probably not on purpose, killing their patients because of a lack of good research evidence. So he said, okay guys, what we need to do is, instead of just working on our clinical expertise and our own backgrounds, we need to actually go away and look at the scientific research evidence and base our practice on that. So out of his work, which was Efficiency and Effectiveness, I think is what it's called, 1971, the whole Cochrane collaboration has sprung up, and that's an entire global research collective which has done systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomised control trials, so the most robust form of effectiveness type testing that you can do to advise clinicians on which forms of how should they base their practice, so which drugs they should use, which conditions, and so on and so forth. And this pyramid will be very familiar to lots of you, and this describes which forms of evidence clinical practice ought to be based on, according to the Cochrane model. So systematic reviews are the most robust because it gathers all exhaustive types of evidence which are relevant to one particular question in one place and summarises it. Next, under that is randomised control trials, which minimises bias through a particular form of distribution of participants and so on and so forth. So it ranks all the different kinds of evidence which clinicians might use, all the way down to editorials and expert opinion, which is what we do. So don't feel like you need to listen to us at all. Okay, so evidence-based medicine has tried to solve some of these problems of how do we move from research evidence to practice in lots of different ways. One of the ways in which they've done that is by setting up particular institutions and developing particular processes to move from research to practice. So one of them is the NICE guideline development process. NICE is the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and it uses guideline development groups, which are set up groups of practitioners, lay people, so patients and carers, and various other health professionals who are all associated with a particular problem, so for example, head injury, and they move through this very detailed process to come up with a set of recommendations on a particular problem. So it's a clear, transparent way of moving from research to practice. The other thing that medicine's really developed is public involvement, so public and patient involvement, and this is just from Leicester, but this, virtually every NHS trust has a group which is designed to help involve the public in decision making, not just about how the practice itself is run, so how the trust identifies priorities, but also what research is done and so on. And the James Lind Alliance is an organisation which actively tries to develop research agendas, so it gets together patients, clinicians, and researchers and says, okay, what are the top 10 priorities in anaesthesia that we need to work on next? So it's really about trying to come up with processes and institutions to involve the public and other relevant stakeholders in solving some of these problems about how we move from evidence to practice. So evidence-based policies try to do some of the same things, and lots of you will know about the What Works centres, and they've sort of used NICE as a model and said, okay, can we use the same kind of process to address, for example, issues in education or issues in crime, criminal justice? And it's sort of worked to a greater and lesser extent. There's now, I think, I should check this, I think there's about 7 of these now. Yeah. Yes. And there's one for Scotland as well. And they use a similar guideline development process, but they sort of have varying degrees of transparency about which they do that, and for very good reasons. So, for example, in criminal justice, the types of stakeholders which you need to involve are going to be much, much more diverse than they will be in health, where it's very clear who's making the decision at what point. A doctor, when they go into a room, knows which clinical guidelines they need to draw on in order to have a conversation with the patient. If you're a police commissioner, you're not having that one-to-one conversation with someone about how to make a decision that's going to affect their lives. You're trying to affect the lives of the entire population. And of course, that's a very different process. Nevertheless, they have these institutions. But the kinds of evidence and expertise they need to draw on, it's just going to be really different. So clinical practice, again, there's usually a very strong evidence base, but what's considered expertise in policy is often very different. So this is a quote from an interview which I did some years ago with someone who works in an NHS trust about commissioning of stroke services. So the evidence says that you need to have specialised centres to deal with stroke, right? So instead of dealing with it in a normal hospital, you have a specialised centre. And this doctor says he got very frustrated in the discussion because it said it in the BMJ. This is like the gold standard comic for doctors. Stroke units save lives. And so as far as he was concerned, that meant that that's what they should do. They should commission stroke services. But that wasn't what they were talking about in this policy-making commissioning committee. What they were talking about was the Director of Finance's aunt, who'd had a bad experience. And that was what determined the context of that discussion. That was what determined the discussion, the decision in the end, was someone's personal experience. That was the key bit of evidence which actually mattered in that room. Another example is, I was talking to someone in the Department of Health about how Andrew Lansley pulled together the Health and Social Care Act. That's now 5 years ago. And I said, what kinds of evidence did he draw on? And he said, what Andrew Lansley did was he asked, where are we? And how do we get ideologically, philosophically, politically and socially from A to B? So he drew a huge scope for the kinds of evidence which might be useful in that process of moving from A to B. Any relevant information which helps develop a policy proposition was what he considered to be evidence within that context. And finally, just talking sort of at local government level, this council officer said to me, well, yes, evidence is useful. We do use local data. Numbers count for a lot, but good stories aren't enough. We use all sorts of things. So again, anything which convinces other people. The point of the evidence is not there to determine a particular decision, but it's about making an argument and creating a narrative. I just like this quote, so I thought I'd put it anyway. So this is about what gives an evidence credibility. So why would you ever consider an expert to be an expert in a policy space? And when you ask academics, they say it's me as a person. It's because I've got a professor title. We've got a number of professors on the panel. I'm sure they'd all absolutely agree with that. But there's a lot of different aspects that go into considering credibility. So why would something be considered, why would evidence be considered credible in a particular space? Well, it's because it comes from a particular institution. It's associated with a particular individual who has particular qualifications. It has a particular set of interests sort of attached to it. It's gone through a particular due process, as with a nice evidence. So, experts can come from a number of different places, but in terms of our discussion, what is an expert in the policy space doesn't necessarily mean what Michael Gove meant, which was an economist. It might mean someone who simply knows more than everybody else in the room. It might mean someone who's got personal experience of a set of experiences, I suppose. So it might be a relevant stakeholder who can contribute to that decision. So there's a number of different ways in which we can be experts. And just to sort of summarise the sort of lessons that we've been thinking about from learning from evidence-based medicine, what that might mean for evidence-based policy. Evidence-based medicine's come up with its institutions, nice local implementation teams, and experts, sort of very clearly defined clinicians and patients and carers. There's a set of clear processes, and what's considered evidence is also very clear for that space. Whereas in evidence-based policy making, there are the institutions, but the processes are not nearly so clear. They're not as transparent as they might be. And that can be a strength or a weakness. And similarly, the types of evidence which we consider in policy are much, much broader. And again, that can be a strength or a weakness, depending on how you look at it. So what lessons can we learn? Well, most of the research that we do kind of aims to either increase the amount of research used in policy, tries to tell policymakers that they need to use evidence more, or tries to upskill them. And I think one of the ways in which our work is trying to contribute to the field is to say it's not quite as simple as that. What it tends to do, most of the research there, is ignore really important issues about power, about the public, as Paul said, and how democracy might actually be an important player in this field, the practicalities of how we use evidence, and I would argue reality. So this is a tweet that I saw yesterday from a public health conference, and it's true that medicine is now starting to recognise that power is important, that ethics are important, that democracy and the public are key and important players. But just sort of saying that politics, ideology, power, ethics and values are important doesn't solve any of the problems of who's who's going to be an important player in that space. Actually, we need to think more carefully about how power affects what evidence is available, how it frames what evidence is used and who's involved. So in terms of Brexit, what can we learn? Well, if we learn anything, it's that we know we as researchers, as political commentators, aren't asking the right questions. I'm sure you all know Matthew Godwin as a political commentator, and he was very clear that Labour were going to do very, very badly, and he offered to eat his book on Brexit if he was wrong, which he subsequently did, so well done, Matthew. But we know that, it was such a surprise, Brexit result, the general election result was such a surprise. It's clear that we're not asking the right questions about what's going on. And what we actually perhaps need to think about is, rather than coming up with new experts and new institutions or processes, we need to think more carefully about how people who are in the position to make decisions, what kinds of evidence they need, how they need to find it, and who should be involved in that process.